Thank you, Carol, for giving a very good introduction to what I'm going to talk about. It's put here as a rhetorical question, not simply for the sake of a speech, but actually it is a question. We don't really know what it is to mainstream gender in REDD. I work for an international development organization called CARE that has been working on the subject of gender for decades. And we believe that we are capable of doing gender-sensitive and gender-equitable programming in many sectors. And REDD has us slightly confused because we're not really sure what difference the REDD bit makes to the whole art and craft of mainstreaming gender. I'm going to speak in this presentation about a particular project, which is the one that I'm attached to and I know very well, called HEMA in Zanzibar. And after I've described that project and explained a little bit what we're doing on gender in that project, I'm going to try to raise a more general question about what does that mean for mainstreaming of gender in REDD, particularly in REDD. What difference does REDD make? And then at the end, some questions for the audience, perhaps that help us just discuss yourselves. Let me start off with a bit of background about HEMA. It's a pilot project for REDD, financed by the government of Norway, and it has an explicit gender objective in its project design. So for us, gender is not simply a nice way of doing things or the good way to do something. It's actually a declared objective, and the project will be a failure for us if it's not gender equitable. Which means that we have all of these layers of ambition in the project. We have to protect forests, which is what the whole purpose of the project is. We have to do it through community management. Because it's REDD, we have to make sure that we're generating carbon income as a result of that community management for protecting forests. Because we're a development agency, it has to have an impact on poverty, and all of that has to be done in a gender-sensitive way. So we are trying to do gender-sensitive, pro-poor, carbon income-generating, community-managed protection of forests, which, as you can imagine, is a very ambitious task. So just a little quick bit of background on the context of Zanzibar, so you understand a bit more about what I'm going to present on the project design. The main drivers of deforestation are clearing of land for shifting cultivation and cutting for firewood and for charcoal. Now, the cutting of firewood and charcoal is not only for domestic fuel, it's also a source of cash income, particularly for women. So there's a strong indication that there's a gendered dimension to the drivers of deforestation in Zanzibar. The other issue that I wanted to raise is about the ownership of land. In Zanzibar, land is owned by the government and it's only ceded to the communities on a usage basis, which means that nobody is a landowner, and therefore the issue about women's rights to land are not necessarily about ownership, it's about their command of power within the community decision-making structures. And then finally, one of those community decision-making structures is the Village Conservation Committee, which is the main organ at local level that manages community forests and therefore needs to be the starting point for any local initiative on REDD. That's background. So this is the logic of the project. We're going to reduce deforestation and forest degradation in order to improve the lives of men and women. Sounds simple. We're making it slightly complicated because we're also trying to generate carbon income, which we also hope will improve the living conditions of men and women. So we have this dual objective of benefiting people directly but also indirectly. And we're doing that through two main sets of activities. One is protecting the forest to reduce deforestation, but the other one, which is more important in fact, is to reduce pressures on deforestation so that that reduction of rates of deforestation is sustained. Now, actually, most of it is not REDD, and I think that's one of the issues that's a bit of a complication for us when we talk about gender in REDD. A large part of this project is simply, good development, good gender-sensitive conservation. It's about protecting forests, reducing pressure on forests, and not much to do with REDD. The REDD bit is that income bit. What the innovation that REDD has generated in this whole debate about development and conservation is that it's generated a source of money for something called carbon. And that's the novelty that we're trying to get our head around. So this little was red on my presentation, it's now orange, is the bit that's challenging us. How do you make that bit gender sensitive? So our project activities to complete this diagram, this blobogram of the project, we're protecting the forest through two sets of initiatives. One is to strengthen those village conservation committees that I talked about, but also to improve land zoning in the villages so that it's very clear which areas of the forests are protected and which areas of the forest are available for sustainable exploitation. As far as reducing pressure on the forest, we have to produce alternative sources of income so that cutting wood is no longer a strategy that poor people turn to in order to make money. And we also have to provide alternative sources of fuel if we're going to reduce the amount of wood that can be taken off the forests. And along with that, we have to manage the carbon finance, otherwise it's not a REDD project. So some of the challenges that we've faced so far, sorry if I'm talking so fast, but I know that I only have a few minutes. Some of the challenges we've faced so far. One of the issues we're trying to do is to strengthen the village conservation committees, as I mentioned, and for us that also means improving their gender awareness. However, those village conservation committees has very low level of capacity and skills in many of the areas that are needed for REDD. So to add gender awareness and genderize the way that they work, along with all of the other capacity gaps in terms of numeracy, in terms of computer skills, in terms of biomass monitoring, and all of those things that REDD will require, is adding one more thing to a very long list. That's one challenge. Another challenge, another activity that we are proposing in this project is that we will be involving women in the practical activities around REDD so that they can be directly involved in it and be directly visible as active actors in the creation of the carbon good. But the problem with that, we foresee, will be a great deal of cultural resistance. Zanzibar is a Muslim society, and there are some pretty prescribed gender roles in terms of mobility and access to the forest. But some of those barriers are not just simply cultural, they are real risks. And we have to be careful that we're not exposing women to risks that they are not capable of confronting. And then the last challenge I want to talk about is the issue of how you incorporate women's own organizations in an activity that's new for them. I'm talking specifically about village savings and loan groups, which in Zanzibar are predominantly female dominated, which makes them, in theory, a fantastic vehicle for empowering women and giving them voice and influence on village institutions. But guess what the main activity of the village saving and loan group is? Cutting wood. So we have a bit of a contradiction here about how we harness a very strong village level organization whose main activity, or one of whose activities, is actually destructive to the environment in the current circumstances. So those are some of the challenges that we're having to face of putting REDD in practice on the ground. So I'll move on to now a bit of a more general reflection based on the experience of HEMA, but what does all of this mean for the gender mainstreaming in REDD? Here's the project design that I showed you before, and we're going to flow a gender mainstream through it like this. And for us, again, I was mentioning earlier that we're struggling with what difference does REDD make. Those things, strengthening village committees, improving land use planning, alternative sources of income, that's business as usual. That's just good development, that's just good programming. There's nothing particularly REDD-tastic about it. So we have a list of things that we are proposing to do. Some of them we've started, some of them we haven't yet. But we still ask ourselves, what difference does REDD make? Why do we have to put gender in REDD particularly? Why not just gender in everything? So the way we thought about it is try to think, okay, what makes REDD different? First of all, it's about money. It's one of the few conservation instruments, the few development instruments that actually produces cash straight to the village, and it's unlikely to be at the level of an individual household. So one of the gender implications of that is that you have to strengthen women's control over that resource. Another thing that's very specific about REDD is that it's contractual. Nobody has yet decided whether REDD is going to be market-based or fund-based, but in either way, the generator of the REDD credit will have a contractual relationship either with a private dealer or a government fund or an intermediary, which means that the rights and responsibilities attached to the flow of money from REDD will be contractual, and they will have a legal basis, which means that the legal empowerment of women is critical if they're going to manage working with REDD. And finally, the other thing that's pretty distinctive about REDD is that it's a much longer time frame than we're normally used to working with. Carbon contracts, particularly for REDD, which has a long gestation time, are typically in the region of 30 years. Most of our projects are lucky if they reach 5. So one of the implications for that is that we have to work with the next generation, because they will be inheriting the obligations and the rights that are attached to a REDD project. But still we're struggling, because actually all of this stuff is stuff we should be doing anyway. It shouldn't need REDD to make us work with young girls. It shouldn't need REDD to make us think about legal empowerment of women, and it shouldn't need REDD to give women's voice in financial control of village resources. So we're kind of still struggling about what's different with REDD. So I come to the very end of my presentation now and just hazard a suggested answer about what might be different about REDD, which is relevant for what's happening here this week and this fortnight. That the financial incentive that's attached to REDD is attached to the social safeguards that come in either the legal instrument that establishes REDD through the UNFCCC or what the commercial market will require. A carbon credit will be more valuable if it has a strong social value attached to it, and therefore that gives us the opportunity to use that as an entry point to look at gender. The safeguards in REDD, both the ones in the UNFCCC text and the ones in the REDD Social and Environmental, have got a very strong gender. Well, in the case of the LCA text, it's the word gender, which is already but they have an opening for us to get very serious about gender. And I think that in my experience anyway, it's one of the few places in the enabling political environment that we're working in where actually you can say to somebody who's skeptical about doing gender in a project, you say, listen, you've got to do gender because somebody else says so. And actually that can be a very powerful argument for reluctant local officials or people who feel that it's just too much bother. You can say, well, if you aren't gender sensitive in the way you run this project, you won't sell your carbon credits, which is a pretty low argument, but it works. So some tentative conclusions just to round off. Many of the gender strategies in REDD are actually just good development. It's no big deal, but it being attached to REDD gives us a way of re-emphasizing it, and it makes us look at it again. And the standards and the safeguards that are in the REDD architecture are a useful entry point for that.